I have 5 rounds left in the magazine. My cousin's smirk is aimed straight at me. And half my family has their phones out waiting for me to embarrass myself. What none of them know, what I've never once told them, is that I spent 18 years teaching soldiers how to do exactly what I'm about to do at this range. Tyler thinks he's about to humiliate me in front of everyone we love. He has no idea he just handed a loaded weapon to the wrong person. By the end of that afternoon, nobody at that gun range would ever look at me the same way again. My grandmother's 80th birthday party was supposed to be a simple thing. Potato salad, a rented tent in the backyard, and 40 relatives arguing over who got the good folding chairs. That's the kind of family I come from. Loud, close, and just competitive enough that every gathering turns into a quiet contest over whose life looks better on paper. I flew in from Fort Bragg the night before wearing jeans and an old flannel, driving a rental car because my truck was still parked back at post. Nobody picked me up at the airport. Nobody offered. That's not a complaint. That's just how it's always been with my mother's side of the family. I learned a long time ago not to expect much fanfare, and honestly, I never wanted it. My name is Morgan Ellis. I'm 38 years old, and at the time of that party I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army with 18 years of service behind me, including years spent as a firearms instructor for a unit most of my family couldn't have named if their lives depended on it, but none of them knew that. Not really. To them I was just the cousin in the army. A vague, slightly pitiable phrase that got tossed around the same way you'd mention someone's timeshare or their gluten allergy. The party started the way these things always do. My Aunt Carol was showing off photos of her new lake house. My Uncle Pete wouldn't stop talking about a boat he'd bought that he could clearly not afford. And then there was Tyler. Tyler Brooks is my cousin, 41. Loud and successful in that specific way where he needs everyone in a 50-foot radius to know it. He'd pulled into the driveway that morning in a truck so polished it looked like it had never touched dirt, wearing a tactical brand t-shirt that probably cost more than my last uniform allowance. Tyler owns a chain of insurance offices, which is a perfectly respectable thing to do with your life, except Tyler has never once described it as perfectly respectable. Every accomplishment gets narrated like it's a chapter in his autobiography. He found me by the drink cooler within the first 20 minutes. "There she is," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder like we were old army buddies instead of cousins who saw each other twice a year. "Still marching around, Morgan." "Something like that," I said, and reached past him for a bottle of water. That should have been the end of it. It never is with Tyler. He launched into it right there. His new gun collection, his membership at some exclusive shooting club, 2 towns over a regional match he'd placed, in that he described with the kind of detail usually reserved for war stories. Though, as far as I could tell, the closest Tyler had ever come to combat was an aggressive round of golf. I nodded along, sipping my water, letting him have his moment. That's something the Army actually did teach me. You don't have to win every conversation. Sometimes the smartest move is silence, but Tyler doesn't do silence well. My quiet just seemed to feed him. "Seriously though," he said loud enough that a few cousins glanced over, "what did they even teach you in there?" "Bed making, marching in circles." A ripple of laughter went through the small crowd that had gathered near the cooler. My Aunt Diane, standing off to the side with a paper plate of deviled eggs, laughed the hardest. I felt the heat rise in my face. Not embarrassment exactly, but something close to it. The old familiar sting of being underestimated by people who share your blood. "You still in the Army, honey?" Diane asked, tilting her head like she was asking about a part-time job at the grocery store. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Still in." I didn't elaborate. I never do. Explaining my actual job to people who've already decided what they think of it has never once gone well. And frankly, I've never needed their approval to know what I've built with my life. There's a strange kind of peace that comes with being underestimated. People stop watching you closely, which means you get to watch them instead. But Tyler wasn't done. He never is. "Tell you what," he said, grinning around at the small crowd like he was setting up a punchline. "Tomorrow morning family trip to the range. I'll show you what real shooting looks like." More laughter. Someone, I think it was my cousin's wife, actually clapped. I looked at him for a long moment, and something inside me went very still and very quiet the way it used to right before a live fire exercise. Not anger, something closer to recognition. I understood in that instant exactly what Tyler needed from me. Not a rival, not a threat, just a soft target he could feel good about beating in front of an audience. Sure, I said simply. Sounds fun. Tyler laughed like I'd just agreed to something adorable. Don't worry, I'll go easy on you. I smiled and said nothing else. I've learned that the people who talk the loudest about their skill are usually the ones who've never had it tested by anyone who actually knew what they were looking at. Tyler had spent years building a reputation in rooms full of people who didn't know the difference between confidence and competence. Tomorrow, for the first time, he was going to stand next to someone who did. I finished my water, set the bottle down, and went to find my grandmother, who was sitting under the tent, looking tired and happy in equal measure. She patted the seat beside her, and I sat glad for a moment of peace before whatever was waiting for me at that range. I had no idea yet how much that trip was about to change. The next morning came in bright and clear, the kind of crisp fall air that makes everything smell like cut grass and gun oil once you get close enough to a range. My grandmother stayed home to rest, but nearly everyone else piled into trucks and SUVs and made the 20-minute drive out to Cedar Ridge Shooting Sports, a sprawling indoor-outdoor facility Tyler talked about like he owned a piece of it. I rode with my mother, who spent most of the drive, glancing sideways at me, like she was trying to figure out whether I was nervous. I wasn't. I was something closer to curious. The way you get curious, watching a storm build on the horizon, knowing exactly how it's going to end, but still wanting to see the shape of it play out. Tyler had reserved what the range called the VIP lane, a private section with better lighting, cushioned stools and a small television mounted on the wall that nobody was watching. He'd brought an entire case of firearms with him laid out on the counter like he was displaying jewelry, a customized 1911, a tactical AR variant with more attachments than it probably needed. A Glock with aftermarket sights, he mentioned no fewer than 3 times. Guns are an art form, he announced to nobody in particular, running a hand along the slide of the 1911 like he was petting a dog. People don't get that. It's not just point and shoot. There's a whole philosophy to it. A few cousins nodded like this meant something. My Uncle Pete said, "Damn right." Though I doubted he could tell a philosophy from a flinch. I stood off to the side, arms crossed loosely, watching the way Tyler handled his weapons. There's a lot you can learn about a person's actual experience level just from how they move around a firearm, how they check a chamber, how they hold it when they're not shooting, whether their finger drifts toward the trigger out of habit or discipline. Tyler's movements were fast and showy, more performance than procedure. Not dangerous exactly, just untrained in a way that had never been tested hard enough to notice its own gaps. The target carrier hummed as he sent his paper target out to 7 yards. 7 yards is close. It's the kind of distance where a reasonably competent shooter should be able to keep every round inside a fist-sized group without much effort. It's not a test of skill so much as a test of basic consistency. Tyler squared up, planted his feet in a stance he'd clearly practiced in a mirror, and started firing. The first 2 rounds landed low and left. The third missed the paper target entirely, punching into the back stop with a dull thud that made a couple of the younger cousins laugh nervously. He emptied the rest of the magazine in a rush like speed alone might make up for accuracy. When the target rolled back in, it told the real story, a scattered, embarrassed constellation of holes with no discipline to the grouping at all. Tyler set the gun down harder than necessary. "Triggers off on this one," he muttered. New gun still breaking it in. Nobody argued with him, though I noticed a range employee nearby glance over with the particular blank expression professionals wear when they've heard that excuse 100 times before and know better than to say so out loud. Then Tyler turned to me and I felt the shift in the air before he even opened his mouth. This was the part he'd been building to since yesterday afternoon by the cooler. "All right, Morgan," he said, picking the Glock back up and holding it out toward me, grip first with a grin that was trying too hard to look generous. "Your turn. Let's see what the army taught you." A few phones came up around us. My cousin's wife angled hers like she was already imagining the video she'd post later. Someone chuckled. My mother's fingers tightened slightly around her purse strap, the closest she'd come to defending me all weekend, though she didn't say anything either. Don't worry, Tyler added loud enough for the whole lane to hear. I'll walk you through the basics after. No shame in it. I looked at the gun in his outstretched hand. Then at the shredded uneven target still hanging downrange. Then at the row of faces around me, some amused, some mildly uncomfortable, none of them expecting anything from me at all. That more than anything else was the thing that had followed me my whole life, not their mockery, their absence of expectation. I had spent nearly 2 decades being extraordinary in rooms that never got to see it. And standing in front of my own family, I was still invisible in the exact same way. Sure, I said, keeping my voice easy. I'll give it a try. I stepped forward and took the Glock from his hand. It felt familiar the second my fingers wrapped around the grip. Not because it was a special gun, but because holding any well-made firearm feels the same to someone who spent thousands of hours with one. Balanced, purposeful, quiet the way tools are quiet right before they're used properly. Tyler stepped back, arms folded, wearing the expression of a man who already believed he knew exactly how the next 30 seconds were going to go. Around us. Conversation dropped to a low murmur. Someone's phone camera clicked on with a small chime. I racked the slide, checked the chamber out of pure habit, and faced the target, hanging 7-yard downrange, the same distance Tyler had just missed entirely. I didn't say anything clever. I didn't need to. I just breathed in slowly, let half of it out the way I'd taught 100 younger soldiers to do, and settled into the stillness that comes right before a shot that matters. Before I fired a single round, I did something Tyler clearly hadn't bothered doing with any of his guns that morning. I actually looked at the weapon in my hands. I checked the grip angle, feeling where my palm naturally settled against the backstrap. I lined up the front sight against the rear notch, letting my eye find that familiar relationship between the two. The front post crisp and the rear slightly soft, exactly the way it should be. I found the trigger with the pad of my finger, not the crease, and located the wall, that subtle point of resistance right before the break, without applying enough pressure to send anything downrange yet. It took maybe 4 seconds. To someone who doesn't know what they're looking at, it probably looked like hesitation. "What are you going to read at a bedtime story?" Tyler said, and a couple of the younger cousins laughed. I didn't respond. I've learned that responding to noise like that only feeds it. Instead, I settled my stance, squared my shoulders to the target, and let my breathing slow into the rhythm I'd used more times than I could count. Not just on ranges, but in places where the stakes were considerably higher than a family barbecue. I exhaled halfway, held it, pressed the trigger straight back. The first round broke clean. I didn't rush the second. There's a temptation, especially with people watching, to speed up to prove something through sheer volume of noise. I've trained enough young shooters to know that's exactly the instinct that ruins a group. So, I reset the trigger, found my sight picture again, and fired the second round with the same unhurried patience as the first. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth, 5 rounds, maybe 8 seconds total, start to finish. Not fast by competition standards, not slow either, just controlled the way it's supposed to be. When accuracy actually matters more than speed, I lowered the gun, thumbed the safety without even thinking about it, and set it down on the shooting bench exactly the way I'd been trained to 1,000 times over. Behind me, the lane had gone quiet in a way it hadn't been all morning. The target carrier were dragging the paper forward on its little motorized track. I watched my family's faces instead of watching the target come in. That told me more than the group ever could. My mother's hand had come up to her mouth. My cousin's wife had lowered her phone entirely. Camera forgotten. Tyler's jaw had gone tight in that particular way people's jaws do when they're trying to keep their face from doing anything readable. When the target finally stopped in front of us, nobody said anything for a solid 3 seconds. 5 holes almost stacked on top of each other, dead center, tight enough that from 10 feet away, it looked like a single ragged wound rather than 5 separate shots. It was the kind of group that doesn't happen by accident. It's the kind of group that happens after years of repetition, thousands of rounds. And the particular discipline that gets beaten into you, not by natural talent, but by relentless patient correction. A range employee walking past the lane actually stopped mid-stride to look. Tyler recovered fast the way people do when their pride needs somewhere to go. "Lucky," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "Beginner's luck happens sometimes." I didn't argue. I never do. There's no version of that conversation that ends well. And honestly, I've spent enough of my life being underestimated to know that the people who need to see the truth eventually see it whether I point at it or not. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, unhurried, even the gait of someone who'd spent a long time learning not to rush toward anything. I turned and saw an older man approaching the lane, silver-haired, built solid, despite his age, wearing a range polo with an owner's badge clipped to it. He had the kind of weathered, watchful face you only get from decades of paying very close attention to dangerous things. He looked at the target first, really looked at it the way someone reads a signature rather than just glancing at a name. Then his eyes moved to me, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition trying to place itself. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying an easy weathered politeness. "Ma'am, are you Morgan Ellis?" The question landed in the middle of my family like a dropped plate. I felt a small private smile pull at the corner of my mouth, the kind I rarely let anyone see. "It's been a while," I said. Tyler's confident posture faltered just slightly like a building settling on an uneven foundation. His eyes flicked between me and the older man, trying to read a conversation he clearly wasn't prepared for. "You two know each other?" he asked. And for the first time all weekend, his voice had lost its edge. I didn't answer right away. I let the moment breathe the way I've learned to let silence do the talking when words would only get in the way. Because the man standing in front of me wasn't just any range owner. His name was Jack Donovan. And the last time I'd stood across from him, neither of us had been holding a rental Glock at a family shooting range. We'd been somewhere very different, doing something very different, and the memory of it was about to walk straight into the middle of my cousin's carefully built afternoon. Jack Donovan didn't wait for Tyler's question to get answered. He turned toward the range employee hovering near the lane and said in a tone that made it clear he wasn't asking, "Bring that target down. I want to keep it." The young employee blinked, glanced at me, then hurried to comply, unclipping the paper from its carrier like it was something fragile. Jack turned back to me, and the formality in his posture softened into something warmer, something closer to the way old friends greet each other after too many years apart. "You on leave?" he asked. "Just visiting family," I said, "grandmother's 80th. He nodded slowly, taking that in, then let his eyes drift over the small crowd gathered around our lane. My mother, my aunts, a cluster of cousins, and Tyler standing frozen at the center of it all, still holding his phone like he'd forgotten what it was for. "You two know each other?" Tyler asked again, quieter this time, like he already suspected the answer was going to cost him something. Jack let out a short laugh, the kind that comes from genuine memory rather than politeness. "Know each other," he repeated, shaking his head. "Son, this woman didn't come here to shoot years back. She came here to teach." The word landed in the middle of the group and just sat there. "Teach." My Aunt Diane said, the same aunt who'd asked me the day before if I was still in the army, honey, like it was a summer job. Jack nodded, warming into the story the way people do when they've been waiting years for the right audience. "Advanced Training Program Joint Services, maybe 8 years back now. I hosted part of it here before I bought the place outright. We had instructors coming through from all different units, some good, some average, some who talked a big game and folded the second the pressure got real." He glanced at me, something like respect settling into the lines of his face. "And then there was Lieutenant Ellis." "Colonel now," I said quietly. Mostly out of habit, not because I wanted the correction to land the way it did. Jack's eyebrows lifted, genuinely impressed. "Lieutenant Colonel. Well, that tracks." He looked back at the small crowd. "I watched this woman put 5 rounds through a target at 50 yards so tight, you'd have thought she'd only fired one. I've trained a lot of people in my life. I don't say things like that about many of them. I felt the weight of my family's eyes shift all at once in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not looking through me the way they usually did, but actually looking at me. It was a strange sensation, almost disorienting. After so long being the quiet, slightly pitiable cousin at every holiday gathering, Tyler tried to recover his footing. "I mean, anyone can get lucky at a range," he said, forcing a laugh that came out thinner than he probably wanted it to. "One good group doesn't mean anything." Jack turned to him with the patient, faintly amused expression of a man who'd spent decades listening to people talk themselves into holes. "Son, I've seen lucky. Lucky doesn't look like that." He nodded toward me. "That's not luck. That's 20 years of repetition standing in front of you." 18. I corrected softly. 18 years. Jack said, "Of doing this so many times, it stops being something you think about and starts being something you just are." He looked at my family, all of them still somewhat stunned into silence. "You folks didn't know." Nobody answered right away. My mother finally spoke, her voice smaller than I was used to hearing from her. "She never talks about work." Jack looked at me for a long moment and something like understanding passed between us. The particular quiet of two people who'd spent their careers around others who talked far too much about far too little. "No," he said, "she wouldn't." I could feel Tyler's discomfort radiating off him even without looking directly at him. This wasn't the version of the afternoon he'd built in his head on the drive over. He'd imagined an audience watching him teach his quiet, forgettable cousin how to hold a gun properly. Instead, he was standing in the wreckage of his own missed shots while a decorated range owner recounted in front of the entire family exactly how far out of his depth he actually was. "I didn't know you trained anyone," Tyler finally said. And for the first time all weekend, there wasn't any mockery in his voice. Just something quieter, something that sounded almost like the beginning of shame. "There wasn't a reason to bring it up," I said simply. "It's just my job." "Just her job," Jack repeated almost to himself, shaking his head with something between admiration and disbelief. He looked around at the family again, taking in the awkward silence. The phones now lowered, the expressions caught somewhere between embarrassment and disbelief. "You people have no idea who you've got sitting at your dinner table." "Do you?" Nobody answered that either. My grandmother's birthday guest list had just been quietly rearranged in everyone's minds. And I could see it happening in real time. My aunts recalculating years of comments. My cousins reconsidering every joke they'd made at my expense. Tyler standing very still, staring at the target Jack still held in his hands like it was suddenly the most important piece of paper in the world. I didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything I needed to add. Sometimes the truth doesn't need defending. It just needs enough silence around it for people to finally hear it clearly. Jack wasn't finished. Men like him rarely are once they found an audience worth talking to. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, my family was actually listening. "You want to know something else?" he said, turning back to the group target still in hand. Like a piece of evidence he wasn't ready to put down yet. "This woman used to run qualification courses for officers twice her rank. Full colonels, some of them coming through expecting to breeze past the standard, and she'd have them redoing basic drills because their trigger control wasn't where it needed to be." He chuckled, shaking his head at the memory. "I watched a bird colonel get humbled by a captain half his age once right here on this range. Nobody complained. Everybody just got better. She trained officers." My cousin's wife asked, her voice carrying the particular disbelief of someone realizing she'd spent an entire drive over mentally rehearsing a video caption that no longer applied. "Trained them, evaluated them, signed off on whether they were ready to lead soldiers who'd be trusting them with their lives." Jack said, "That's not a small thing. That's not something you hand to just anybody." I shifted my weight, uncomfortable in the particular way I always get when someone else is doing the talking about things I've spent years keeping quiet. "Jack," I said low enough that it was mostly just for him. "You don't need to do this." He looked at me and there was real warmth in his face, the kind that comes from mutual respect built over shared difficulty rather than easy familiarity. "Somebody should," he said simply. "You never did toot your own horn. Not once, not back then either." I remember trying to get you to let me put your name on a training plaque we hung in the lobby. You talked me out of it. Didn't seem necessary, I said. Never does to people like you, Jack said. And then almost as an aside to the rest of my family, that's usually how you know somebody's actually good. The ones who need everybody to know it usually aren't. I didn't look at Tyler when he said that. I didn't need to. I could feel the sentence land on him anyway, the way certain comments do, even when they're not aimed at anyone in particular. My Uncle Pete, who'd spent the drive over bragging about a boat, cleared his throat. So all those years we thought you were just, I don't know, filling out paperwork somewhere, something like that, I said, and let a small smile show. There wasn't any bitterness in it. Not anymore. Just a kind of tired amusement at how completely my family had built an entire narrative about my life out of nothing but their own assumptions. I remember one time, Jack continued, clearly enjoying himself now. She qualified expert on every single course we ran that cycle. Everyone. We had guys who'd been shooting competitively for 15 years who couldn't touch her numbers. And the whole time she was the quietest person in the building. Wouldn't even come up and get her certificate in front of everybody. Had somebody bring it to her office instead. That's true, I admitted. I don't love standing up in front of rooms. No kidding, my Aunt Diane muttered. And there was something almost apologetic in the way she said it. Like she was hearing herself from the day before quizzing me about whether I was still in the army, honey, and not particularly liking the sound of it in hindsight. I glanced over at Tyler. Then he'd gone quiet in a way that didn't suit him at all, arms crossed, jaw tight, staring somewhere just past my shoulder, like he was trying to find a version of the last 24 hours where none of this had happened. Part of me almost felt for him. I understood in a way most of the family probably didn't exactly what was happening inside him. The particular vertigo of realizing the story you've told yourself about your own superiority was built on a foundation of somebody else's silence. A younger cousin, maybe 16, spoke up from the edge of the group, his voice carrying the unguarded curiosity kids that age still have before life teaches them to be careful with their questions. Wait, so are you like actually really good? Like professionally? I looked at him, then at Jack, who was watching me with an expression that clearly expected me to deflect the way I always did. I'm decent, I said instead, which was as close to honesty as I was willing to get in a family gathering. Jack's being generous. I am not, Jack said flatly, and the finality in his voice closed the subject better than anything I could have added. The group had shifted entirely by then. The mood, the posture, the way people were standing around me instead of past me. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody gasped or cried or did anything you'd expect from a movie. It was quieter than that, more like watching a photograph slowly develop, the real image emerging underneath the one everybody had assumed was there all along. And standing in the middle of it, holding the crumpled remains of his own humiliating target from earlier. Tyler was the only one who still looked like he hadn't quite caught up to what was happening. That I suspected was about to get considerably worse. It was Tyler who broke the silence, and in hindsight, I should have seen it coming the second his ego started looking for an exit. All right, he said, straightening up, forcing some of his old bravado back into his voice, like he was pulling on a jacket that no longer quite fit. One good group doesn't prove anything. Let's actually compete. Real test, not just standing still shooting paper at 7 yards. Jack raised an eyebrow, glancing at me with the faint amusement of a man who'd seen this particular move before, the wounded ego, trying to reset the terms of a game it had already lost. You sure about that, son? Positive, Tyler said, some color returning to his face now that he had a plan, however poorly conceived. Let's do it properly. Multiple distances, timed mag changes, the whole thing. I could have declined. Some quiet, tired part of me actually considered it the part that spent 18 years avoiding exactly this kind of spectacle. The part that's always preferred to let my work speak in rooms where nobody was filming. But there was something in Tyler's face, some last flicker of desperate pride that told me declining wouldn't actually spare him anything. It would just leave the lesson unfinished. Sure, I said. If Jack's willing to run it, Jack was more than willing. In fact, I think some part of him had been waiting years for an excuse to put together a real course of fire again instead of just watching weekend warriors punch paper at close range. He walked us through it himself. 3 shooting positions at varying distances, a mandatory magazine change under time pressure target transitions between multiple silhouettes, and a strict par time on the buzzer. It wasn't an exotic test. It was essentially a scaled-down version of a basic qualification course, the kind of thing I'd run hundreds of soldiers through over the years. But it was more than enough to expose the difference between someone who owns a lot of guns and someone who's actually trained with one. Tyler went first. He seemed to want that some last attempt to set the bar himself before I could set it for him. The buzzer sounded and things fell apart almost immediately. He fumbled the draw from his holster, wasted almost a full second just getting his grip established. His first shots were rushed, chasing speed instead of accuracy, and it showed in the scattered hits low on the target. When the mag change came, his hands weren't ready for it. He fumbled. The release dropped the spent magazine at an awkward angle and lost nearly 3 full seconds, just getting the fresh one seated. His stance drifted between positions instead of resetting cleanly. By the time the final buzzer sounded, he was breathing hard, sweat visible at his temple, despite the cool morning air, and the targets told a story of urgency without control. Jack read off the numbers without any unkindness in his voice, just flat professional assessment. Tyler's time was mediocre. His accuracy was worse. Several hits had drifted outside the scoring zones entirely. Triggers just not broken in yet. Tyler muttered again the same excuse from earlier, though this time it landed with considerably less conviction, especially in front of an audience that now understood exactly what real competence looked like. Then it was my turn. I stepped up to the line and something in me settled the way it always does, right before a course of fire. A kind of narrowing, everything extraneous falling away until there's just the weapon, the targets, and the quiet mechanical rhythm of doing something I've done thousands of times before. I didn't think about my family standing behind me. I didn't think about Tyler's face or the phones that had come back up or even Jack standing off to the side with his stopwatch. I just breathed, found my grip, and waited for the buzzer. When it sounded, everything moved the way it's supposed to move when the fundamentals have been drilled past the point of conscious thought. The draw was clean. The first shots landed exactly where I wanted them. My sight picture returning to the same spot after each recoil without needing correction. The magazine change happened without any wasted motion. The old mag dropping free the instant my hand found the new one. The reload seated and the slide released almost before I'd finished the thought. I transitioned between target positions smoothly, my footwork carrying my aim rather than fighting it. And by the time the final buzzer went off, I'd barely broken a sweat. The range went quiet again. That same particular silence from earlier, except deeper this time. Jack read off my numbers, and even he allowed himself a low whistle at the final tally. A time well under par with every round landing inside the scoring zones, most of them clustered tight enough to overlap. He didn't need to say the comparison out loud. The gap between the two performances was obvious to everyone standing there, even the family members who couldn't have told you the difference between a sight picture and a grocery list 20 minutes earlier. I didn't celebrate. I never do. I holstered the weapon, Jack for running the course, and turned to find the rest of my family staring at me with expressions I hadn't seen directed my way in years. Not pity, not polite tolerance, but something that looked uncomfortably close to awe. Tyler stood off to the side, arms loose at his sides, staring at his own targets like he was trying to find some detail that would explain away what had just happened. There wasn't one, and for the first time all weekend, he didn't say a single word. The drive back to my grandmother's house was quieter than the drive out had been, though it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that settles over people when they're busy rearranging something in their heads, quietly reworking years of assumptions into something closer to the truth. Nobody made a single joke about the cousin in the army for the rest of that afternoon. Nobody asked if I'd learned to make my bed particularly well. My Aunt Diane, who'd laughed the loudest at Tyler's comment by the cooler the day before, found me in the kitchen later while I was helping wash dishes and stood beside me for a while before finally speaking. "I'm sorry," she said, not looking at me directly, focusing instead on the plate in her hands like it needed more attention than it did. "We never really asked about any of it." "You didn't know to ask," I said, and I meant it. There wasn't any bitterness left in me by that point, just a tired kind of understanding. I'd built my career in rooms most of my family would never see, doing work I couldn't always talk about, even if I wanted to. And somewhere along the way, I'd let that silence become the whole story people told about me. That wasn't entirely their fault. I'd let it happen. Later that evening, my grandmother found me sitting alone on the back porch, watching the last of the daylight fade over the yard where the party tent still stood half taken down. She lowered herself into the chair beside me with the careful deliberateness of 80 years. And for a while neither of us said anything. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" she finally asked, not accusing, just curious in the gentle way grandmothers ask the questions nobody else has earned the right to. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I didn't want to be remembered for my rank," I clear's throat said. "I wanted people to know me, the actual me, not a title." She nodded slowly like that was an answer she understood better than most people her age would have. "Well," she said, patting my hand with fingers that had gotten thinner than I remembered. "For what it's worth, I always knew you were something special. Didn't need a shooting range to tell me that." I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Tyler found me a little while after that, once most of the family had drifted inside. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a moment, hands shoved in his pockets, looking younger and less certain than I'd seen him look in years. "Hey," he said, "got a minute?" I nodded and he climbed the steps slowly, sitting down on the top one instead of taking the empty chair beside me like he needed the distance for what he was about to say. "I owe you an apology," he said, staring out at the yard rather than at me. "A real one. Not the kind I usually give." "You don't have to." "I do, though," he said, cutting me off gently. "I've been doing that my whole life, Morgan. Ever since we were kids. Grandma used to brag about you, about your grades, your discipline, all of it. And I never felt like I measured up. So, I found other ways to feel like I was ahead, buying things, talking loud about hobbies I was mediocre at. Today, just kind of blew all of that up at once." I studied him for a moment, surprised by the honesty in it, the lack of any performance behind the words. "I never wanted to compete with you," I said. "I didn't even realize we were in a competition." "I know," he said, and something like a rueful laugh escaped him. "That might be the most humiliating part of the whole thing." I reached over and shook his hand, firm and simple, the same way I'd shake the hand of any soldier who'd just learned a hard lesson the honest way. "A good shooter doesn't prove anything with words," I told him. "Only with discipline. That's it. That's the whole secret. There isn't a shortcut." He nodded slowly like he was actually hearing it this time instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. I left for the airport early the next morning, dressed the same plain way I'd arrived, jeans and old jacket. Nothing that would have told a stranger anything about who I was or what I'd spent nearly 2 decades building. But something had shifted inside that family quietly and permanently. Nobody looked at me like the poor cousin in the army anymore. They looked at me like someone who had simply let her work speak for itself in her own time on her own terms. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted. Not applause, not recognition, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that competence doesn't need to shout to be real. It just needs enough patience to wait for the moment it's finally seen. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the quiet one in the room, underestimated by people who should have known better, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you. So, hit subscribe if you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's keep this journey going.